All right. Well, I'm going to turn the time over to Greg, and he can introduce Ross for us. And we're sure excited to have you be here.
First of all, Rob drove probably 100 miles. So if anybody thinks the Sisters of Liberty are important, it's former Congressman from the 1st District, Rob Bishop. And his wife, Geraldine's with us here today. She's been with him a very long time. We won't ask him how long that is, but
38.
that's true. 38 years. It's probably north of that.
The kid who's 46, I think it's a little bit older than that.
I met Rob somewhere around, I don't know, 1990, 1992, 1996. I was, at one time I was working for the Utah Council of Small Business about the time that he was, when he was in his heyday at the Utah State Legislature. And I worked on a project for Utah United for tax limitation. I think that's when I first met Rob. And then for years I did political races. I did Jim Hansen's race for about 20 years before Rob got into it. And both Rob and I are great fans of the late Jim Hansen. But then I had the opportunity to do Rob's congressional races in 2002, 4, 6, 8, 10, and clear up to 18. I do paid political ads. I wasn't the sole person involved, but I did radio and print and some other things. And so, as you know, a couple years ago, if you remember, I was here to talk about my book, a book of fiction called The Invitation to the Shining City. And as I was looking for readers to give me praises, I thought of my friend, the congressman. And so I gave Rob a book to read, and he liked it. And he says, oh, I wrote a book. You did? Has it been published? No. I says, how many words is it? Oh, I don't know, 200,000, 228,000, something like that. And I thought, Rob, that's a 700-page book. And so he sent it to me. And I started reading it. I thought, this is really good. This is really, really good. I told Geraldine today, she may not have heard this before, but a lot of us refer to Rob as a Bob Newhart of Utah politics. So when you get his book, and we expect you all to at least think about buying it, it's really entertaining. And he will take you through some funny things that happened to him. For example, when you're running for Congress, there are 2 rules you need to know about campaigning. First of all, red licorice is for conventions. Starbursts are for parades. You don't mix those up. So there are little tidbits in there, but I'll be very brief. I think when you get the book, you might want to read chapter 4 first. It's called Facing Nanny Government, Progressivism and the Loss of Values. And this is his definition of nanny government. He said, nanny government had a skewed view of the world as a potential Garden of Eden where desires were fun, free, and riskless. At least Adam and Eve were smart enough to choose to live in the real world. Nanny government has left for posterity a bloated bureaucracy, huge national debt, and unsustainable entitlements that have become a giant Ponzi scheme. In conclusion, I would just say, talk about that scene just before Christ is taken to Golgotha. And Pilate asked him, who are you and why are you here? He says, I've come to testify of the truth. And what did Pilate say? What is truth? It's such a rare commodity today, and I especially when it comes to political and governance. So what you'll get when you read Rob's book is not only the truth, but the truth that will keep you spellbound until you finish all 488 pages. So with that, this is Rob Bishop, my friend, former client, and collaborator. And we talked about the fact that I've been It's been really hard to get the cover done. And so he reminded me of the agony and the ecstasy. Michelangelo painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo had to please the Pope. I just had to please the bishop. So with that.
No, I thank Greg for that introduction. Most of it was true. And let me start off with first of all saying how pleased I am to be here. I have been here with you once before, about 50 pounds, a broken foot, and a stroke ago. When I was trying to become lieutenant governor, that didn't work out too well, did it? But I appreciate being here because I also appreciate what you were doing and the commitment that you have, and the effort to try and become involved, as well as understanding what's going on, which is it's tremendous, and I appreciate that. Let me also explain, I think, the red licorice and starboard, so you kind of get the perspective. In all my years, I found out that if you want to attract at a convention people to your booth or table, it's red licorice. I don't know why it is. We've tried black and chocolate. It's only red licorice. People will walk across the room to get red licorice, where they will just avoid even more expensive treats that other people give out. So it's cheap and it's a draw. Same thing when you're in a parade. If you're going to throw candy, it has to be Starburst or nothing. If you throw taffy at kids, they will throw it back at you. So do not throw taffy. It's cheaper and they understand that. But once you actually get a Starburst out there, all of a sudden they come up with, even though it's more expensive, kids will jump with joy for the idea of actually having a Starburst that's there. I have to tell you one experience. I was in Duchesne County at the Duchesne County Parade, Air Parade. And the Duchesne commissioners are really, they're a different group. It's wonderful. They will buy really expensive candy and then freeze it. So it's hard. And then when they're on the float going through there, they will chuck that candy at the kids with as much fervor as they possibly. It's like they're getting all the frustrations of all their committee meetings out at once. And it's amazing because you'll see a kid get hit with a piece of candy from a commissioner and start to cry and whimper, and then look down and see it's a peanut butter cup, and all of a sudden it totally changes. I don't know how the commissioners in Duchesne get away with it, but it's brilliant in what they do, and it works for them. So those are things I have learned in a whole lot of years trying to go through parades and conventions and stuff like that. I will tell you, when I started, the reason I actually wrote the book, which didn't start as a book, but I had taught, before I went to Congress, I'd been in the legislature for 8 terms, I was Speaker of the House. I had taught advanced placement government for about a decade and a half. And I went back to Washington expecting to be kind of understanding of what was going on since we had talked about it so many times. And as soon as I got back to Washington, the first thing I realized is all the textbooks that I had read on Congress were wrong. I'm sorry, they're just wrong. Dan McCulloch once said that the Congress is like a river. It's always flowing and always changing, which is true. And I have to admit there, in one of the years where I was on the transition committee, my job was to try and change the rules of the House, and I was pretty successful in getting quite a few of them actually changed. So it's always, by the time a textbook actually goes through the review process and is printed, it's already out of date. So everything I had been teaching in my legislative lessons, it was worthless. It was just wrong. I was emphasizing the entirely wrong things. It was not how Congress actually operates. So what I started to do is write down the experiences I had and the things that I had understood of what would be the readings I wish I had had when I was actually teaching, and wish I could go back in time and start over again, and this time actually do a legislative unit that was accurate. So what comes up with the book, and that's why it was Greg's title to come up with things I learned in Congress I never taught in school. It's because what I learned in Congress, it is not taught in school, and it's not taught in any of the textbooks as well. So it's an effort to try and explain how Congress works, how it's operating, what the functions are, the interesting things, at least I thought, of the variances that went along with it. But I also, when I started teaching AP government, I decided to do something a little bit different. I had been a political science graduate. I had gone all the way through. I had been teaching school for about 10 years, 20 years before I started doing the AP classes. I realized I had never read the Constitution before I started teaching the class. So one of the things I did with the class, with my classes, is to make sure we went through the Declaration of Independence, first of all. and understood what the words meant. And then we went through the Constitution, especially Article 1 as it dealt with the legislative branch, and try and explain what those words meant at the same time, which is how I start out this book that we actually did. The first 4 chapters are really the philosophy of government, which is what they intended in the Declaration and the Constitution, which to me do fit together. The Declaration was an instigation of abuses they had suffered under the hands of the British, and the Constitution was a solution to those abuses, which is amazing to me, especially when we forced on kids, they hated it, but we did it anyway, to read through all the verbiage that's in there, because there are some amazing things they require you that my kids would say, why? Why did they put this in there? But if you understand the history of what they were trying to avoid that the British did, it makes total sense. It's brilliant to me anyway. And then I also tried to make my kids understand that what the purpose of the founders was is to build a system of government that would be effective government, but still guarantee individual liberties. And I could try then to get them to understand there's a difference between individual liberties and rights and civil liberties and rights. To me, individual liberties are still individual gifts from God to you that have to be protected from the government. Whereas civil liberties are group rights given to groups of people by the government. It's a totally different concept. And the Constitution was to ensure individual rights would be guaranteed. At the same time, you came up with an efficient form of government. And to do that, they were pure Newtonians. They had to believe Newton's idea that for every force there's an equal and opposite. Now, every action there will be an equal and opposite reaction. Madison called it his competing ambitions. Or we call it checks and balance and federalism. But the structure of government was the key element to make sure that it was there. So I wanted my kids to understand the structure of government meant you had to understand the horizontal checks and balance system, and more importantly, and what they never actually teach in school, is the vertical checks and balances between the national government and the states. And we call it federalism, which is the key. If you don't understand federalism, you don't understand what the founders were trying to do and understand the book, which is why he asked me to start with chapter 4, which is my version of nanny government. There are 2 kinds of extremes, at least I think. You can either have big government, which is totalitarian, and that's the command government that fell apart. And when the Soviet Union failed, we should have realized command government just doesn't work. And most businesses get that. A lot of people get it. The government, not so much. The other part, though, is nanny government, which to me is like big government, which is not trying to tell you what to do except out of kindness. The idea is risk aversion, which means if we're going to spend a lot of money on health care and Medicare from the government, and it's expensive, what we should try and do is cut down the expenses by telling you how to live your lives, what to do, what to eat, what to wear. That's in the effort of trying to be kind to you so that we can be risk averse. I think risk aversion is the worst thing possible. I don't know if any of you remember or read Moneyball or saw the movie.
Saw the movie.
There's a great line in there that talks about a player who never commits an error is not necessarily a good player. An errorless shortstop could be someone just too slow to ever get to the ball. You can't make an error unless you actually touch the ball and try and make a play. And if you're too slow to get involved, that's it. To me, that's what the government does with risk aversion. When we try and make sure that nobody ever gets in a situation that is negative, that means we put standards and requirements on people in the name of kindness. The United Kingdom already did a survey going through to look at what people had in their refrigerators in London. Because let's face it, if the government system pays for all the health care, then you want to find out if people are eating the things that are going to encourage them to use less health care or not. So they did an inventory of what Londoners had in their refrigerators. They didn't confiscate the ice cream yet, but they made the inventory. And to me, that's a problem that we face in the United States and a fear we face. So there are some people that want small government. That's what the anti-federalists want, the Articles of Confederation. That doesn't work. There are some that want big government, which was command economy. That doesn't work. There are some that want nanny government to try and be nice to you to death. And then there's limited government, which is what I believe is the goal the founders had, of just enough government to be efficient, but still protecting your right to choose. And to me, when I try to find with my kids, even at Utah State now, when I teach the class what individual liberties mean, I use the word choice all the time. In church, you use free agency, but here you use choice all the time. And because choice becomes extremely significant. So one day when I was still in Congress, I had the opportunity of going to Germany. I met a lady who worked in the foreign ministry for Germany. This is when Germany was united again. And she had been born in communist East Germany. So she and her sister, her mother, had grown up into that system. And she remembered when the Berlin Wall fell down because she was a preteen. And she and her mother made their first trip into West Berlin. And they went into a supermarket. And they were just awed when they went into the supermarket because they saw all this stuff that you could buy. And she said she went to one counter and she walked down the counter and there was this entire row of nothing but sugar. 6 different brands of sugar. Because back in Potsdam in East Germany, there was either sugar or no sugar, and it was usually no sugar. And here were 6 different brands, and she was just in awe of it. And then that communist mindset, the command economy where the government tells you what's right for you, set in, and she said, the second thing I thought was, why do you need 6 brands of sugar? Wouldn't one be sufficient? Because in that mindset, you have to realize for someone to be free, you have to have choices. That's the definition. If you don't have choices, you don't have freedom. And more importantly, you need 6 brands of sugar to guarantee you have any sugar at all. That's the mindset that the communist world never quite got. And that's the mindset that nanny government people never quite catch or concept. So the first 4 chapters are about that philosophy of government for the kids. Then I go into how Congress is actually organized and operated. And then at the end, we put in another 5 or 6 chapters about the first election, what it took to actually get there, and some of the election stories I had, experiences that I had back in Washington. And at the end, I'll give you a couple of specifics. We go over land policy and how Utah has been abused by the federal government on their changing the way they use land policy and how it hurts us. I go into, if you remember several years ago when they tried to get nuclear spent fuel rods that would be stored above ground next to the test and training range, which is the training depot, the training range.
In Tooele?
Yes, yeah. Which is it's just not a good idea to put an above ground nuclear spent fuel rod dump next to a bombing range. It took about 5 years to get that done. It started with Jim Hansen, it finished with me, but I kept all the emails. So I have another chapter of how we went through the process to actually win that battle and keep Utah from being a dumping ground. I don't care if we take care of our fair share, but I didn't want us to become the dumping ground, which it would have been had that be the case. I also, thanks to Greg, tried to put in some solutions of what I think are about 10 steps that could be happening right now that would make our country better. Now, the biggest solution is still to understand what the role of government is supposed to be and making sure that our government does not exceed that role and purpose of government to guarantee that you always have as many choices as you possibly can have. But we try to do that. And I tried to put in stories and incidents that my kids would have hopefully enjoyed going through them, especially dealing with the presidents. I got to know very well both President Bush and Obama and Trump at the end, and there were some unique experiences I had with them. Can I just tell you one?
Please. Sure.
George W. Bush is, I was once in Brussels at a meeting, and the British parliamentary member of the European Union, and this is pre-Brexit, he was there and he said, Bush had just come over and talked, and he said, the thing you need to do is have Bush come over more often and talk to us, because we have this strange vision of what he is going through the media. But when you realize him in person, he said he is comfortable in his own skin. So the very first time I ran, for some reason, I got the opportunity of going back to Washington and get a personal audience with George W. Bush. Actually, there were 20 of us that had that wonderful experience. 18 were running for the Senate, 2 of us running for Congress. And I was the second to the last one. So they had 2 pictures that we were going to get, but we could use for campaigns. The first one would be in the Oval Office, where they would take us in with a sheet of paper. The paper had my name and how much money I had in my campaign, my opponent and how much money he had in his campaign, and they said, you get 1 picture. Go in there, be serious, don't say anything, just look serious at it, because you get 1 shot. You laugh and you screw it up. You won't get a second chance. So I went in there and I handed the paper to President Bush, and he looked at it and he said, "Ah, you can read this one, Eve." And I laughed and I screwed up my picture. Fortunately, he gave me a second shot. But I said, no, don't give me that. I mean, he's a multi-millionaire. He's going to be able to spend millions of his own money on this campaign. And Bush looked at me and said, with your hair, you'll win easily. Now, during that campaign, as I was always meeting with the Democrat candidate, he would always say, when I go back there, I'm going to support George W. Bush. And I just always wanted to say, but never did, yeah, but he thinks you're a weenie. Then we got one other picture that we could use. With the Rose Garden, there's a colonnade on the West Wing. And we would walk down with the president to the end. He would drop them off, come back, pick up the next one. And like I said, he had to do this 20 times. And I'm second to the last. So I'm starting to think, I'm getting nervous now, because what am I going to say to the President of the United States? This is my one chance. What am I going to do? And then I started to feel sorry for him, because I thought, this must be really boring for you, walking down and listening to this dribble, and then coming back, and then walking back down again and listening to more dribble. So I was nervous, and when it was my turn, the first thing I said, and my problem is I talk before I actually think. So the first thing I said is, you're like, after me, there's only one more. And he laughed and said, thank you. And then as I started walking by, I said, I wanted to be different. And I said, you know, if I'm elected, the one thing I really want to accomplish is get the Montreal Expos to be moved to Washington. And I had forgotten that George Bush is a huge baseball fan. And the guy lit up. So I actually had more FaceTime with Bush walking down and back and waiting than anyone else did. And pictures we used for the campaign look wonderful, like we're discussing the Iraq War and everything else. And if you can read lips, you'll have to realize we're talking about where the baseball stadium would be built. He wanted a place on New York Avenue, and I thought rebuilding RFK was the right thing to do. And at the very end of that, being the kind of person he was, he said, well, who's your favorite baseball team? And as a fool, I told him the truth. He said, the Cubs and the Yankees. And then I realized he was the former owner of the Texas Rangers. Duh. And then I said, oh, and the Texas Rangers. And without missing a beat, he said, now they're a bunch of overpriced crybabies who can't win anyway. That's the real George W. Bush. Do you have any questions before I ramble on again? Because I found out in my classes at Utah State, I can ramble for a whole lot of time about what we were trying to accomplish, what the book may or may not have in there for you.
It's just fun hearing you.
Nancy?
Yeah, I mean, some of us back in the 80s were hearing King George and some of the overstep with CIA, his former roles in the CIA. What do you know about that?
Who's he? George W.
George W.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, not George W. George
H.W.
H.W.
Yeah.
Very little, except the fact that one of the problems, and this is one of the things I mentioned in the book, is there are a lot of agencies that are, okay, let me go back the full way. Two presidents I dislike intensely, and I apologize if any of these are your friends, because one was the hero of my grandfather, and what can I say, you can't pick your relatives.
FDR.
Actually, Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh.
He loved Teddy Roosevelt. My problem with Teddy Roosevelt is when he came into office, he did not believe in federalism.
No.
He didn't believe in balanced powers vertically. He thought most decisions should be made in Washington. So that was the first problem. And in fact, the idea of executive orders took off.
You're too loud, yeah.
The idea of executive orders took off in his administration. There had always been executive orders. Washington did 8 in 8 years. From the Civil War to 1900, that 50-year period of time, there had been 158. I mean, one was the Emancipation Proclamation, so there were some biggies, but there were only 158. Teddy Roosevelt did 1,000 by himself.
FDR did 3,700.
Yes. But it's worse before that, because between them was the worst president we've ever had.
Woodrow Wilson. Yep.
Who did 1,800, because Wilson didn't believe in horizontal separation of power. He thought checks and balance system, he called it voodoo, he called it governmental, I don't know, he said you're hiding power in different spaces, and he said that was wrong. He thought of himself as the prime minister. He was the one, and this is where I'm getting to your question, he was the one that said decisions should be made by the experts. Keep it out of the hand of politicians. He didn't believe in the legislative branch. They're a bunch of has-beens. He didn't believe in the voice of the people. Let the experts who know everything tell you what is right for you. And he did 1,800 executive orders, and that's when rules and regulations just exploded in the United States, which is what is still happening today, and it was later on. The one thing I do like is there are a few people, Paul Ryan was one of those, who as Speaker of the House tried to get clawback of authority that should be with the legislative branch that has been just given to the agencies to make rules and regulations, and there's no way of doing it. I thought Paul Ryan had the right approach to it. He just failed in the delivery of it, and I'll write about that in the book. That's one of the failures in there, of not taking an adequate role of making sure that Congress claws back the power from the agencies. Because I'm sorry, if an agency makes a rule or regulation, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
There's literally nothing you can do about it. You can complain, like fly back to Washington and throw rocks at their windows. If you wanted to take them and have a tribunal, a court hearing, you get to go to one of their judges from the agencies that have an amazing ability of ruling for the agency. The only way you can do that is having the legislative branch having more control, which theoretically they're supposed to. It just doesn't work because there's too many agencies. And bringing it back to them so they can have that kind of oversight decision, which is one of the things that we need to do and have. And I also blame Congress for doing it.
Yep.
The executive orders, the president cannot make something that violates a law
Yep.
that is passed. Congress makes vague, stupid laws that never get passed. The first Congress we had, there was the issue over postal routes. Where would the postal routes be? Because there's some financial advantage wherever you actually ended with the mail. There's some development that took place there. And it was the end of the session, everyone wanted to go home. They trusted George Washington, so they all said, let's just let Washington decide where the postal routes would be. John Page of Virginia stood up and basically shamed Congress into doing their job by saying, well, why don't we just let Washington do everything and not show up at all? He literally shamed them to stay there and do their job to define where the postal routes would go. That's the kind of Congress we need. If any of you read any of the TARP language a long time ago, if you remember that when the actually it was George W. Bush, the very end of his administration.
Yeah, that's right, going out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when the bank failures were going in there, read the language and it tells you that the Secretary of the Treasury will determine which financial institutions deserve some kind of financial help. The Secretary of the Treasury will determine how much each financial institution. That's what the law said. When Congress writes those kind of vague laws, the agencies can do anything they want to. And the agencies will continue to do anything they want to until Congress actually steps up, writes specific laws, and actually takes the power back.
Well, they don't even need to write specific laws. They just need to uphold the ones that are there.
There are too many loopholes.
Yeah.
The problem.
Yeah.
And Obama showed that in his last 2 years, when he no longer had to run for office again.
Mm-hmm.
That's when he said, I'm going to rule with a pen and a telephone.
Yeah.
That's when his executive orders just exploded as well. And anywhere there was a vague area, that's where he would run through. And there are so many vague areas you can drive through with a Mack truck.
Yeah.
And when he actually went too far, that's when the states came back, and they did go to the courts, and the courts pushed him back. But only on those areas where he went too far. But we opened the door for him to go to what he actually did, and that's where we had to claw back. I always contended, and I did when Ryan put me on that task force, that Congress has to establish in every committee an oversight committee, like the state of Utah does. The state of Utah has an interim committee that reviews every agency order in the state of Utah, and then they'll deal with it in the session if they think they need to. Congress needs to spend their time going through every agency order, rule, and regulation to review it before it's implemented. Not let it implement and then try to
reverse it.
Yeah, do it before. And the argument that was given to me on why we couldn't do that is it would take too much time. Congress would spend all the time reviewing the agency rules.
But it would take 3 times longer to undo it.
Exactly. And because of some of the procedures we have, you can't undo it at all. So, I'm sorry, are there any other questions before I start rambling again here? I really am worried about that, yeah.
Okay. We had a guest, and he said that Utah made 500 laws this year, 10 minutes on each law, which is off on her. And he shared how that was really
Not good.
It comes with the ability of establishing an agenda. Now, when I was Speaker and Majority Leader, I'm anal retentive, so
I actually established an agenda. It was like I did a syllabus for the session. So we established what I said were our 6 major issues, and I set the deadline of when those issues would be decided. I really didn't necessarily care what the issue, how we decided it. I just wanted them decided at that time. So it meant that we did them at a regular basis, so you didn't have everything piling up until the last week, on the last day, when you try and rush through all that crap. So we ended with all the major issues being done ahead of time, and then we didn't have to spend the entire day on that last day going through legislation that probably wasn't worth looking at in the first place. So it's the ability of doing an agenda. Now, that's one of the solutions I have in the book as well. Congress needs to do that same thing. They need to establish an agenda. Problem for Congress is, no one knows when the end is. Even if you run out of time in the calendar, that's not necessarily the end. My first year when I was elected, we spent the first month in January doing the stuff the old Congress had failed to do in December. So we had to do their crap first before we could ever start on our own things for that next coming session. And the problem for Congress is, since they don't know when they're going to quit, they can't ever back plan, as we did in Utah, to establish dates on when we would actually make decisions so you didn't fuck everything. Which means Congress often punts things down the road because they run out of time and they haven't found their ideal solution. You don't do that. Congress needs to be given a firm end date of when they have to be done so they can at least back plan to decide when they make decisions. One of the problems that every level of government has, if government is involved in making a decision, you know it's not an easy decision or it would have been decided before that. So there was one year where the courts made a decision on our tax structure, and we had to change our tax policy by a court order. And this is in the Utah Legislature. And we struggled all session to try and come up with an ideal way of changing our tax structure that would not raise taxes. There wasn't one. So on the 45th day, we finally decided, all right, this is the best we can come up with. We have to make that decision. Because the session ends after 45 days. So having an end date means, okay, you got to make a decision. Washington would never do that. They would simply say, let's keep trying to find the perfect, even if it's never out there. So you punt it and keep on going. And that's why things take years in Washington, and they go on and on forever, and no one ever makes a decision, because there's not a simple end date. And that's one of the solutions. Have an end date. There's another one that this is something that bothers me. Have any of you gone back to Washington and watched the debate on the floor? Well,
Not one. I have, actually.
in Washington? Do you remember anything about
I was a teenager. I just remember it being kind of long and going nowhere.
And no one was there.
Yeah.
We have what we call rolled votes. This is something I hate with a passion. And this is why I spend a lot of time in the book talking about procedures, because John Dingell, who was the longest, I will eventually come up with a sentence.
You got 6 thoughts at once.
John Dingell was the longest serving congressman in the history of Congress. It's just, it's amazing. He served over 60 years. And he replaced his father, who served over 20 years, and he was replaced by his wife, who was still in there. But anyway, John Dingell said, if I let you make all the policy decisions, and you let me do the procedures, I'll screw you over every time. It is the procedures that determine what actually happens. Policy is nice, but the procedures have to work out. So we have this procedure called roll votes, which means there will be a time certain when you're going to go and do a vote. Now, the idea is for efficiency. Well, let's get everyone together and do a whole bunch of votes, and then let them go back and do their work. So you come over and do 10, 11 votes, and then you go back and do some work. Here's the problem. In the good old days of Congress, when it was first established, people would actually go to Congress to listen to the debate. The debate was riveting. Fisher Ames said as a congressman he would go into the chamber and sit down and just listen to the issue, and sometimes change his mind based on the debate. The problem with Congress, with our roll votes, is no one is there to hear any of the debate. Which means you come on the floor to make your 11 votes and look up there and see what the issue is, and the most common expression is, does anyone know what this does? So you look at who the sponsor is, that's good enough, whether I know it or not. One of the things I liked is I was on the Rules Committee, which forced me to hear all the debates for the rule before it came on the floor. So at least when I came on the floor, I knew what the issue was. I'd already heard it before. No one else gets that. I was in my committee hearing once, and we were discussing the mining law. We were making major changes to the national mining law. And I was the only Republican. And I was outvoted because there were 2 Democrats out of 40 members on the committee. The 3 of us discussed the mining law. We had great discussions on the mining law. We talked about really good amendments on the mining law. And then when we 3 were done talking about the mining law, they rolled the votes. And that meant that the other 40 members came walking in looking very prim, very proper, very serious about what they were about to do, except for the one guy from New York who could never find his seat. He was struggling. They came in and they sat down, and then they voted the way the chairman or the ranking minority member told them to vote, because they had not heard a single one of the debates, even on amendments that were proposed that morning in that committee. That to me is horrendous. The idea of Congress should be you listen to the debate and then you vote. And the reason no one listens to the debate is because they're old. In the good old days, when everyone was there, they never knew when the votes would be taking place. They voted in real time, which simply meant people stayed there and they listened and they participated. And I have been in a special session, what was a closed session, where almost 350 members were there, and because of the way we handled the session, everyone paid attention, they listened to the debate, they were respectful, and then they left. It can be done, but we will never do it until you can get rid of that stupid procedure of rolling votes. Rolling votes means people vote in ignorance.
When did that begin?
1900s, and it has evolved since the 1950s. To today, that's the process that everyone actually does. So that's this, to me, I think for most people, this is minimal. No one ever talks about roll votes. In fact, when I usually talk to people about roll votes, their eyes glaze over because it's trivial. But to me, it's a major problem. It's a major reason why people, and if you don't know what the vote is going to be because you've never heard anything, you're going to listen to the leadership to tell you how to vote.
It's like the emperor's clothes.
Pardon me?
It's like the emperor's clothes. They don't want to look ignorant, so...
They just follow.
Yeah.
Why didn't you tell me that when I was actually writing the book? That would have been a perfect thing for me. There may be another paragraph we have to put in.
No.
No, that's perfect.
Can you hold your speaker just out a little bit? Yeah, there you go.
I'm sorry. I'm getting too many P sounds in there. I apologize for that. So those are the kinds of things that I try to go through in the book, the things that I found that were amazing, tricks, procedures, and I admit, most people, their eyes kind of glaze over when you talk about procedures, but procedure means what actually is the end result in the product that takes place.
So I'm interested in hearing more about your experience with Obama and Trump, and more specifically, what you think about the recent indictments of Trump.
Nothing controversial.
Obama is a very formal person. So, he was kind enough, there is one bill I did trying to protect Puerto Rico, that he did send me the copy of the bill. He sent me the pen he signed it with and a nice personal note about it. But as far as actually dealing with people on a personal basis, he can't do it. He's very structured and very formal. As in vast contrast to Bush, who was really very informal with people and had nicknames for everybody. Trump is somewhere between the two. I had the chance of coming back on Air Force One with Trump and the rest of the delegation. And he's a bit ADD, actually. In Air Force One, he has 3 screens going on of different newscasts, and he goes between each and every one of them. So he doesn't need to dwell at any one time because he goes back and forth. Trump also has this ability of flipping Trump on and off. So I have seen him in the White House, in the Oval Office, when he was just talking to a bunch of legislators, as charming and as personable as anyone would ever want to take place to see. And then they bring the media in, and the switch flips, and he becomes the Trump that you see on the news broadcasts. Very curt, very specific. So it's easy to see why people who work with him loved him, because as a person, he really is a very caring and very caring person. But he also has that public persona, which flips over, especially when he's around the media personnel. So I can see why the media is always opposed to him, because they're doing that. Everything that's happening to him right now, if the Democrats wanted to ensure he was the nominee, they should be doing exactly what they're doing. Because it all has an image of
Banana Republic.
Yes.
I call it the Trump phenomenon. The more you try to take him down, the more everybody loves him.
Yep.
It is. And
It's disgusting.
in America, let me try and put it this way. When I was first elected, I got people, usually from Salt Lake, who would send me letters telling me I had to impeach George W. Bush. And I would write, no. And then Obama came in, and I got letters, usually from Cache Valley, telling me I had to impeach Obama. And then Trump came, and I got letters, usually from Park City, telling me I had to impeach. And in each situation, I said, look, I'm not going to do that. I don't care whether you like them or not as a president, but they were elected by the people, and the people need some respect for their decisions. If the people made a wrong decision, that's it. You don't take out a president by coming up with a rule that he trips up to keep them from being in office. You elect them, or you unelect them. And what these things that are happening to Trump look like right now are trying to trip him up with specific little tacky rules that he may or may not have broken, and if he did, big deal. They are simple things that are an effort to try and keep him from being a candidate by trying to trick him up on a rule, and that's the wrong way. You don't do that. Trust the people, let the people make their decision. So in all of these cases, I don't see a reason why anyone would actually bring these charges.
So does that transfer to the indictment on the Biden?
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Well, there haven't been indictments on the Bidens yet,
Leon Hunter for IRS.
but
Yeah.
they're going through the process. So no, I would not impeach Joe Biden. But Hunter Biden is different. He's not the president. He wasn't elected by anybody.
Right.
There is something that smells in that situation.
But if Joe's tied to it.
If Joe's tied to it, then you go from that. You have to establish that fact first. And I'm not jump to that kind of conclusion. Establish that fact, and then you can go to it. But even then, this is another problem. If you just want to impeach somebody, who's going to replace that person?
I know.
I'm not going to impeach Joe Biden for getting the vice president in power.
No way.
Never, ever. And I also told that to the other people too. If you want me to get rid of Trump, who's going to replace him? You think Pence is going to be that much different?
No.
You think Cheney is going to be different than Bush if you want me to impeach him? Come on, get some reality here. And let the people have the decision. It's their responsibility. And if the people make a bad choice, I'm sorry, we're into Mosiah 29 again, aren't we?
I think they'd like to hear Mosiah 29.
I'm sorry. Okay, Sunday I had to give a speech on the Constitutional Church, right? Mosiah 29 is when King Mosiah, as you know, decided not to become king anymore and didn't want his kids to become king, and he didn't want to give them a second chance because they turned it down already, and they decided to change to a republic. So we went from a theocracy monarchy to a theocracy republic. And so in 7 through 9 he talks about good kings and bad kings. In 18 he reminds them that wicked King Noah was only 50 years ago. Don't forget that. In 20 he tells them if you want to be free you have to have humility and prayer. And then 25 he says now you're going to elect your judges, your leaders, which is what we are responsible to do. Now the key element for 25 is when you had a prophet king, the king was the conduit between God and the people to let the people know what the king wanted. Now what Mosiah is telling in verse 25 is now the conduit is you. There is no person. You have to have the understanding, inspiration from the Lord and be in that conduit to know what you're supposed to do, religiously as well as politically. And that explains 26 and 27, verses 26 and 27, where it says usually the people make good decisions, but in 27, if the people chose unwisely, then everything are words I couldn't say in sacrament meeting, but I would have said in Sunday school had I been there. So it's the key elements in that. It is our responsibility. Harold B. Lee, this has nothing to do with the book, I'm sorry, but he was speaking at BYU in the 1960s, and there was an election going on, and students were asking him how to vote. And in his speech, he looked at it and he said, read D&C 134 and Mosiah 29. And after you read that, if you still don't know how to vote, you're dumber than I think you are. That was his quote. Because every Latter-day Saint has the right of getting inspiration to know how to vote. Because
Mosiah what? 29.
29. All of Mosiah 29.
D&C 124. 134.
Yeah. But all of us have the right to get that response, to get that inspiration from the Lord. To me, the Constitution is an inspired document.
Yeah, yeah.
For those of us who are inspired to understand it. And that to me was a key element.
It's interesting that our prophet Nelson is telling us the same thing. Like, no one goes. He could have said, listen, hear me. And we all would have said, okay, yeah, I'll do that prophet. You're not saying that.
The last time the church tried to tell you how to vote was in 1936. And church members didn't do it.
I can't vote the way Earth George vote.
Unfortunately, you don't have to. Because they understand that there is that individual responsibility, and that individual requirement is the most significant thing. They will never tell you what to do and how to do that. And that's the right thing to do it. Nelson could, but he doesn't. Oaks could. They hint sometimes, but they never come right out and do that, because it's our responsibility to do that in the system of government. We have to be that conduit between God.
Do you have any thoughts on the corruption in elections in the media?
The big elephant.
I know.
Yes, I do. And here's my problem. I don't know. First of all, did Trump lose the last election? Yeah, he did.
If you haven't seen all the voter box, if you haven't watched 2,000 Mules, if you haven't seen any of them.
I've seen them all. I've seen them all. I'll still say the same thing. However, the question is, how can you justify, how can you have confidence in the vote? And if the mechanisms that we are using do not bring about that justification, then you've got to do something with the system. Because the system has to be transparent and the system has to be able to be seen, which is why I would like us to roll back a whole bunch of stuff. And it's not just in our time. My grandfather, who came over and worked up in Alta in the logging mills, his boss gave him the day off to go vote, preferably for the person the boss wanted him to. So my grandfather and his brother got off work and they voted in Alta, got on the train, because they had a better way of transportation back in those days, came down to Salt Lake and voted a second time, got back on the train and went up to Kaysville where they voted for a third time that day. I will tell you, my first vote was probably illegal too, and it was hereditary. But the issue is, they voted 3 times. They got away with it. So the reason you have restrictions on registration and the way you can have a way of checking on ballots is so that you don't have multiple votes by other people. So the question we have to answer as a society is, do you want elections to be open and easy to access, or do you want them to be accurate? And sometimes those are different responses. Personally, I would rather have an accurate election than an easy election. And if that means you have to stand in lines and you have to do registration, fine, just so you can guarantee it is accurate. And this is one of the problems I had, one of the reasons I did not like the national government. I was Speaker of the House when the Motor Voter Act went into effect, where we had to change our voter registration forms in Utah. We had really good rules, really good forms, voter rolls, that's what I was trying to say, in Utah. Until the motor voter came in, then every time somebody got something from the government, they had to be offered a chance to register, and we had people registering all over the place. And our rolls expanded, and oddly enough, since that time, our percentage of elections, they told us, kept going down. I don't think it's because people weren't voting in Utah. I'm thinking our rolls were so out of whack because everyone was registered 3 or 4 times that it naturally would never fit that category. That's the wrong way of doing
When you
things.
say the motor, you're talking the Department of Motor Vehicles?
Well, no, it was called motor voter, but anytime you got a service from the national government, they had to ask you, are you registered?
Yeah.
And most people go, well, would you like to register? Yeah, okay. And you filled out a form.
Right.
Which means people registered over and over again, whether they have been registered the first time or not.
My daughter came here, her husband was in the military, she was in Japan 3 years, got here and renewed her license. They had her fill out a voter registration, and then they went off to Maryland, and her mail-in ballot came to my house, and I ripped it in half. But you know how much that goes on? A lot. That's voter fraud. Sorry.
That is, you could have voted for her.
I know.
That's a felony, but you could have.
I know, and I have scruples.
It depresses the vote when you have scruples, but yes.
Yeah. But it goes on all the time, yeah.
Do you have thoughts about the ranked choice voting that's going on throughout the valley?
You have
No,
thoughts about Deidre Henderson and her voting experience?
that would be unfair because I ran for that job. And like I said, I would rather move everything backwards and start coming at it again with a chance of reviewing everything we're doing. And even if it goes back to paper ballots first, do it in a way in which people feel comfortable. Whether there is fraud or not, whether there's a problem or not, people think there is, and you can't prove it. You can't satisfy that. That should be the first job of the election officials, is to make sure you have a system in which you can verify things and make people comfortable. And if people are not comfortable with the system, change it so that people are. That's the first thing you have to do. I'm sure we can come up with a system.
They don't care how we feel, though.
No, they don't.
That's the problem.
Well, I do.
And if there is somebody there that cares.
And they didn't vote for me. No, I get it.
I couldn't vote for you. You're not in my district.
I have a question. Do you think that if Gary Herbert did not allow, because Huntsman did not have his signatures in on time, if he wouldn't have made that decision to let Huntsman run anyway, because he did not technically have his signatures in on time, that Spencer would not be the governor today?
I don't know if I can do the conclusion. Herbert made an executive order, which I've already said I don't like,
Yep.
Yeah.
to change the way the signatures would be recorded.
Right.
I did not think that was correct.
Okay.
With Huntsman not on the ballot, it would have made a major difference in how people voted.
Yep.
Whether Cox would have won or not, I don't know. I think my candidate, Thomas Wright,
yeah.
would have had a much better chance
The red and white signs.
with much better chance with Huntsman not on the ballot, simply because there were a lot of people who were voting for Cox out of fear that Huntsman might be elected if they didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't prove any of that. That's just the hunch I have based on what I was seeing.
And that's corruption.
And that sounds like sour grapes.
I'm sorry, but that is corruption.
That's how we feel too. The Huntsman.
I mean, Herbert had no business doing that.
Yep.
That's corruption.
So now we have to deal with,
Yes, you're right.
The-
By my
yeah.
book anyway, but yes, you're right.
now we have to deal with the monkey on the table and his counterpart.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know, you ran.
Tell us what you think, because we're in,
But I think we're on the right page.
yeah.
No, I think we all kind of basically agree. I wish that had not happened. I don't like the fact that, and we're part of the problem too, I don't like the fact that people gathering signatures. Because to
No.
me, gathering a signature has no indication whatsoever of your ability to be functional as a candidate or an elected official. And there are so many, Doug Lamborn from Colorado served with me, and they have signatures over in Colorado. Some of the people who were collecting signatures for him forged signatures.
Sure.
So the election commission over there threw him off the ballot. Now this is nothing, even though he had enough verifiable signatures, because some of them were forged, the election office threw him off the ballot. So he went to the courts, and the court said, now, the law has to be more liberal than that. The law, you have the intent, not necessarily the necessity. He actually had enough valid signatures, he's back on the ballot. But that's one of the situations which takes place. He had no way of knowing that they were violating, they were forging signatures, but he had to pay the price for it according to the commission, and then the courts reviewed it. That's one of the problems when you do things with signatures. I think signatures is simply a lousy way of doing, and the problem in Utah is the problem that we faced in that primary. There were 4 candidates that were on the ballot because of signatures. When my replacement was elected, the primary was 4 candidates on the ballot because of signatures. And the person who won is the one who had the most amount of money that could do the most amount of ads, and he won with 30% of the vote. We have screwed the process over to try and expand it so people can have alternate ways of getting on the ballot. Now, the convention system, I think, did work. And the convention system allowed somebody who wasn't rich to actually be successful. And that's the way
That's how we got rid of Bennett. And that incensed a lot of people.
It did. But unfortunately, Bennett, bless his heart, is one of my good friends. He was running for a 4th term. Look in the history of Utah, we almost never allow anyone a 4th term. He promised to run twice. He was running for a 4th. Frank Moss lost on his 4th. Watkins lost. Reed Smoot lost on his 4th. Elbert Thomas lost on his 4th. Something about Utah, when a senator runs for a 4th term, the only person who was actually able to be successful was Orrin Hatch.
Yeah.
Who went 7.
And he lied and said, get Garn out, he's been in too long, I won't stay in. And then he did. He lied. But one thing you said...
That's one of the things I want to say with trip limits. I believe in term limits.
I do too.
And so, in 2010, I realized I was on a trajectory to be the chairman of the Resource Committee. And my term would be up in 2018, or 2020. So I announced in 2010 I would run for the last time in 2018. And no one listened. And no one cared. And then when 2018 came around, there were people saying, oh, are you going to run longer than that? I said, no, I told you I was going to quit in 2018 would be my last election. And they didn't know, and they didn't really care. I believe in term limits. I don't think people do. They give lip service about, yeah, term limits are important, but when it comes right down to it, forget it. So, which is why I think Orrin has to go 7 terms.
Okay. One of the reasons why we don't listen when we believe in term limits is for the simple fact if we've got someone good in there, we want to keep them in there because of the...
And that's what the founders wanted. But...
It's a crapshoot after that.
Yeah.
It is. And some people should be out of office after 1 day.
Yeah.
The founding fathers believed that there should not be term limits because you get good people in there and they can... But I don't think they ever fathomed that it would be in this much corruption that we need to change it.
2 terms is enough.
They wanted people to be committed to the national government.
Yeah.
But they never imagined it would take you 30 or 40 years to be committed to the national government.
Right.
That's the part they never
We're still
envisioned.
training Biden.
Well, it pays too well.
Hey, Rob, can you talk about term limits for staffers? Because we've got a whole section in the book where, especially the staffer that worked for the Arizona senator.
Without mentioning names?
Without mentioning,
Why don't we mention names?
So.
Lucian Niemeyer.
Why are we afraid to mention names?
Go on your stage there.
This is one of those issues. There are some times when I got very frustrated because of staff. And sometimes I said, the staff needs to have a term limit. Because the staffer will be put in a position that the member who put him in that position will retire and the staffer stays, especially if it's on a committee. So we had an issue for Utah that dealt with the Utah National Guard, Camp Williams. There was buildings that needed to be constructed. The state of Utah was willing to do it, but the state of Utah would only build on land the state owned. So we did a survey of Camp Williams and found out, lo and behold, only about half of the camp was owned by the state, even though it was a state facility for the state National Guard. The other half was owned either between BLM or the Department of Defense, specifically the Army. So we went back to, and Department of Interior at this time was saying, oh, well, that's okay, we'll just turn the land over to the state of Utah. The Army wanted to have a law. So we crafted a law that simply said the land within Camp Williams would be turned to the state of Utah to build the needed facilities. The state was in favor of it, our delegation was in favor of it, the Army was in favor of it, the National Guard was in favor of it. It passed the House unanimously in both committee and on the floor, and went over to the Senate, and one staffer in the Senate said, now wait, I don't believe that's the right thing to do. I think turning that land over to the state so they could build facilities is an earmark for Utah. Besides, I don't think the Army should pay for the building of those structures, even though it was for the Utah National Guard. And it was one guy. And we couldn't actually help him because his boss was out running for president at the time and didn't have any control of him. So the bottom line is the entire Utah delegation, Senate and House, the entire House, everybody who was in the Department of Defense, were all saying this is the right thing to do, and one staffer sitting on the Armed Services Committee who was never going to go anywhere, said, no, I don't agree with it. And the problem was, he was on our side. It was a Republican staffer, the jerk. He was supposed to be helping us. That's one staffer that we had other times when one staffer would say, I don't agree with that. I'm not going to let you do it. Or one staffer will say, I think we need to make an amendment here, even though he was never elected and not a member, and he insisted that before the bill could come out of his committee, somebody had to change the bill the way that staffer wanted to do. I have all the times, frustrated with staffers who would be appointed, their original appointee would leave, they stayed on the committee, and all of a sudden they thought they were the 101st senator or the 436th representative, and they made decisions, or they made life miserable just because that was their mindset. Staffers have too much power and too much authority. One of the reasons they do is because members serve on too many committees and they have roll votes, so they miss the debate on what's actually going on. I actually think there should be some kind of limitation on staffers as well. But here's the problem when it comes to it. There's some really good staffers who stay there for a long time and they do a good job. But when you get a bad one, it is a miserable experience. Which is, once again, something the textbooks never said. Can I give you one other thing that I think will surprise you, because it usually does my students? In every textbook I read, it talked about log rolling as a technique to use in Congress, which means if I vote for your bill, you vote for my bill. Log rolling.
Quid pro quo?
Doesn't happen twice. It will not happen twice. Leadership in Congress does not like a member that will say, I'm opposed to this bill, unless maybe I can get a bridge or a construction, probably maybe a highway in my district or something. Maybe I can trade off for it. Leadership does not like that individual. And that individual may play that role once, but will never get away with it a second time. So the idea that people can sell their votes back in Washington, it's something that's in every textbook. It doesn't happen in reality because leadership doesn't trust those kind of people. I'll give you one specific example. I was still chairman of the Resource Committee. A guy from Virginia wanted one of the tribes in Virginia to be officially recognized. And I was willing to do it. Now, he'd had problems in sessions before, always bogging down somewhere. Leadership wanted a vote from the guy from Virginia, and they went to him, and the guy said, all right, Mr. McCarthy, I'll give you the vote if you give me my tribal recognition bill. I'll trade off my vote for the tribal recognition bill. Now, McCarthy came to me as the chairman and asked me what I thought of this. Had I said, no, it's a stupid bill, don't do it, he would not have bought off on it. But I said, Kevin, I was going to do it anyway. Go ahead and tell him he can have his deal, but get more than just one vote out of it. Force him to give you a whole lot more than that if he's playing that game with you. That kind of situation happened. But once again, had I said no, it's a bad bill, McCarthy would not have played that game because leadership doesn't like people who try and barter their way into success. It's something that just does not happen more than once.
What's your opinion of McCarthy?
Nice guy.
But no.
I think he's... Every speaker I've had has been different. The first one was Hastert. So naturally, since he was my first speaker, I kind of judged everything by him. Nancy Pelosi was the heaviest-handed speaker. She wanted to have everything done and decided in her office before it ever came to the floor. And she didn't have a firm commitment. It did never actually happen. John Boehner was actually the most conservative speaker we've ever had, and he also believed in the body, and he would say, okay, if we don't have the votes, let's put it out there, and if it fails, it fails. Which I respected. And somebody is saying, okay, let the will of the body be the way. We'll do that way. Paul Ryan was always trying to think around the corner. He said, if we do this, the response will be what? And then what will be the response we have to take after that? He was always trying to think 3 steps ahead. McCarthy does not necessarily do that. McCarthy came back to Washington and worked on the staff of a congressman from California, who was his congressman, who was really a very heavy-handed congressman. He was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and he treated everyone as his personal servant and fought them. McCarthy has a bit of that in him, because that's how he was trained as a staffer. But on the whole, I like McCarthy as a person. Basically, he has good instincts. He's decent, he's right.
Matt Gaetz is sure mad at him.
Tell him about Matt.
Matt Gaetz is mad at everybody. I'm sorry, Matt has a tendency of making demands on everybody, whether he can follow through with it or not.
So you're not a big fan?
No. Well, like when I knew I was leaving, I had my one military guy. I was trying to help him find a job with somebody else. And he went and interviewed with Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz had 17 office workers for him. 16 were in PR. One was dealing with issues in the House. Matt Gaetz loves PR. That's the only thing he loves. I'm not a fan of that.
Rob, did you talk about, when we talked about the joke about the difference between heaven and hell, the right people doing the right jobs in heaven, and in hell, the same people, they have the wrong jobs. You talked a little bit about, in the book, about the Senate should do its business, the House should do its business, and not trying to do more than they're capable of doing.
All right, let me try and do this as I do with my students. The House members have to serve 2-year terms. The Senate members serve 6-year terms. Why? Why do House members serve 2 and Senate gets to serve 6?
Well, the Senate was supposed to represent the states in the olden days, and it was a lot more involved. The Senate was to cool down the Congress.
Yeah, I never believed that crap, but yeah, that's what it said.
That's what Thomas Jefferson said.
Yeah, he said a lot of stuff, didn't he? But there's a reason for 2 and 6. And once again, this is one of the things we try and go through in the Constitution. Like there's meaning to these words. They have a purpose. Members of the House are there for 2 years for one reason. Why? What is unique in the House that only the House members can do?
Control the budget.
Power of the purse.
Can I hear you?
Power of the budget.
Close.
They have 20 powers.
Yeah, but the only the House can start.
The bill?
Yes, the appropriations bill has to start in the House. Only the House can start raising taxes. If the House doesn't do it, it will not happen in the Senate. So the reason the House members are there for 2 years is because they can raise taxes. Therefore, they wanted them to be as closely aligned to the people, so you had to go back every 2 years and make sure that you wouldn't just simply raise taxes and run away and hide. In every job I've had, it's been a 2-year job. I understand it. It's miserable. 4 would be actually nice, but I understand why it's 2 years. The 6 years for the Senate, though, and remember, a president's only there for 4. The 6 years for the Senate is because the Senate was supposed to work on foreign policy. They wanted stability so they could help the United States have a stable foreign policy. And they served longer than a president in case a president wanted to try and cut a deal with himself in a foreign country. They would outlive him and they could mitigate against that. So we are 2 years because it's taxes. They are 6 years because it's foreign policy. And Eugene McCarthy, this time he was actually accurate, once said, if the House stuck to only dealing with the budget and taxes, what it was designed to do, and the Senate didn't get involved with their stupid finance committee. And the Senate stood with foreign policies, and the House got rid of its foreign policy committee. The two bodies were much more efficient and much more effective, because that's what they were designed to do.
I agree and disagree, because taxes didn't start till 1916 when it was, or 1913 with the 16th Amendment. So there, that first 100 years.
There were still taxes.
Yes, they were on the state level.
No, there was national excise tax.
That's right, came from the states.
No, the national government did put excise taxes and tariffs, so they still had that role in it. Now, most of the taxing authority came from the state, and you're right with the 16th Amendment, that's when income tax came on.
Right.
And a whole lot of other things.
So the cooling down thing I talked about with Jefferson was totally that, because there were no direct taxes. Direct taxes came in 1913.
Until somebody changed the Constitution and people voted for it.
Yeah.
And you've been suffering ever since then.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's still a problem. Congress was supposed to deal with the budget, deal with finances.
Right.
Get the Senate out of that. Senate was supposed to deal with long-term foreign relations.
Right.
Keep the House out of that. We would both be a whole lot better. And I'll say, the three amendments we talked about, 16, 17, and 18, they changed the world. 16 gave the national government a permanent source of revenue.
Right.
17 changed the way senators were elected, so the states were no longer had these.
Yeah, I mean, why are we getting advertisements? Re-elect Rand Paul. He's Kentucky. He's not Utah. It's because of the stupid 17th Amendment. Yeah, well, I understand that. Yeah.
And one of the sad parts is that Utah should know better than that. And then the 18th was prohibition, which is now gone. But you established G-Man for the prohibition. They're still here. 16, 17, 18 expanded the national government in a way that was never intended, in a way that shouldn't be done, and yeah, it's wrong. And to me, Amendment 17 is just too much medicine for the problem that was at hand.
And it'll never get changed because no senator's going to vote to keep themselves from to be directly voted on, unless it's a con-con.
Okay. Earl Warren, in one of his decisions, bless his heart, said that representatives represent people, not trees. He was wrong. The Senate was designed to represent trees. It represented an area.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with having somebody represent an area, regardless of what the population basis is. And when they did Baker versus Carr in the Gray Amendment, and when we have to have redistricting based on population only in everything except the House and the Senate, that screwed everything up because Earl Warren was wrong. But why he was wrong is simply because representation makes a difference. In the original way they had it doing, if I was a lobbyist and I wanted to lobby the House and I wanted to lobby the Senate, and the senators were elected by the legislators, I would do a different kind of lobbying for the House members than I would for the Senate. It's an entirely different body, an entirely different approach, entirely different arguments that are necessary. But once they are both elected the same way, my lobbying technique for the House and the Senate is basically the same thing. And if I really want to get cynical with you, most lobbyists back in Washington realize you don't necessarily spend time lobbying House and Senate members. If you're going to be effective, you better lobby the agencies because they make the rules. And until we claw back that power, they will continue to make the rules, and that's the way the situation is.
Well, and Congress just abdicated. Oh, you guys do it. You guys do. And it destroyed it.
It is, and there's something cynical about that. If I say, okay, you guys make the rules, and you don't like the rules, I can tell you, that's not my fault. They did the rules.
Yeah.
Even though I should be overlooking it, they did it. So I can push the blame off of them.
I mean, they could close down the CIA, they could close down the FBI, they could close these things down if they wanted to, by defunding.
I just want the BLM to go away.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's
education.
The Department of Education. I mean, they just have abdicated the throne, so to speak, to all these special interests. 3- and 4-letter agencies.
Which is why Paul Ryan had the right idea when he started the First Amendment, or Article 1 task force. We just failed in delivering. People thought it was too much to do. And people didn't want to take on that big of a task. And I'm sorry, you had to take on that big of a task. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is give you some things that I think you need to take on, whether it's getting rid of rural votes, having an end date so you know how to back plan and put on an agenda, re-emphasizing federalism. There's one thing Alec came up with that I want to have passed is what's called a repeal amendment. Repeal amendment. Look, when Madison and Hamilton talked about having auxiliary precautions that states would have so that they would not let the national government dominate them, I have a hard time figuring out what those auxiliary precautions are. In fact, that was one of the questions I gave to my class the other day. I said, try and find an auxiliary. No one could find an auxiliary precaution. One could be the repeal amendment. The repeal amendment would say that if 2/3 of the states pass an identical resolution about any rule, regulation, or law, that will immediately be repealed. That's not notification, which says it won't work in our state. That says it will simply be repealed. The states cannot tell the federal national government what to do. All they can say is rethink it, do it again. And the national government could come and do the exact same thing again if they want to, but they would have to rethink it. And the question is, getting 2/3 of the states. I mean, one of the arguments against that is you could take the 2/3 of the smallest states and you'd have about 30% of the population. Should 30% of the population dictate the entire nation?
No.
And what I'm saying, if you get 2/3 of the smallest states, that means you've got to get Vermont and Rhode Island and Maryland and Wyoming and Utah and the Dakotas and Iowa to all agree on something. If you can get 2/3 of the states to say there is a problem, the chances are there is a problem. And that would give states an arrow in their quiver, some actual kind of power they would have to push back against the national government, which right now the states don't have.
No.
There is nothing the states can actually do except sit there and take it. Or the other thing I actually recommended this to a couple of people, is quit taking federal government in the first place.
Well, yeah, agreed.
Because if you...
Gary Herbert, look what he did with Common Core, took $500 million from Obama, yeah.
And Common Core is a terrible idea. But it's the same thing. And the biggest problem for the state is when the state accepts federal money, they then accept the federal priorities as well.
Yeah.
So I was Speaker of the House a long time ago, obviously, when to accept Carl Perkins money, which funded vocational, agricultural, and technical education in Utah, and every district takes Carl Perkins money. The national government said, you have to have this computer system we want you to buy. And that's back when computers were big, and the thing was in a laptop, and you had special rooms for them, and they were expensive, and the state didn't want it, and we didn't need it, and we never used it, but we bought it anyway, simply so you get the Carl Perkins money coming in, which means the national government, because of the money coming in, the state of Utah changed our priorities, which if we had never taken the money in the first place, we wouldn't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm boring you all.
No,
all the way here.
not at all.
Or at least...
We're agreeing.
No, we're like, yeah.
Well, or at least not getting into what the book was supposed to have in there. There are some funny stories in there. Contrary to what I'm talking about, there are some
But these are
funny
the things that
stories.
are affecting us right now, and it's nice to hear some answers.
What about the UN giving MAG $19 billion to change our cities?
The smart cities?
Yeah, it's unconstitutional. I mean, we don't have to support them, it's a choice.
Right now in Lehi, we're fighting this.
Yes, $19 billion though. MAG is good at throwing their money around.
And I don't care how much it is. It's not the right thing. The worst system of government is when one level of government raises the money and a different level spends it. That is going to be corruption and unaccountability.
Yeah.
So I had one of the county commissioners in my county come to me and said, Rob, is it really wrong for us to take all that COVID money? Because if we don't take it, it's going to go to some other district, some other county. So why don't we use it? And I basically said, yeah, it's wrong. It's wrong to take that money. Somebody else has raised it, you're spending it, there's no accountability to what you're doing.
Well, it always comes to strings attached.
I agree with, and you just don't, I don't care how much it is, you don't do it.
In Utah County, when that money came in, the COVID money, my husband goes to work Monday morning, he looks in their bank accounts for all of Utah County, there's it was actually, they claimed it was 114, but that isn't true. It was $116 million. And he's like, where did this come from? And it took him 2 hours to figure out where it came from. He was calling everybody.
And I'm sorry, it's wrong. And I have to admit, I voted for the first COVID bill, but I didn't vote for any of the others after that. That was the wrong thing to do.
Who decides that? Like, in other words, like the UN and FEMA, have you seen the indictments on FEMA? Like, we can just say we're pulling out, who decides that? I mean, who in the government says we're gonna support the UN, we're gonna support FEMA, we're gonna support these unconstitutional agencies that are not part of our government?
Those decisions should be made by a Congress that takes a proactive stance on it. And if the Congress does, then there's nothing an agency or the president can do about it. But when we don't do that, then you offer up to a president who can make an executive order to do whatever he wants to. And once again, to me, executive orders
Should not be allowed.
should not be done.
Yeah.
Right.
And a judicial decree that establishes a law should never be done.
Yeah, that's why
That's
Congress is.
an Article I responsibility.
Yeah.
And Congress needs to step up and actually do it. And I'm sorry, I am dumb. Thank you for giving me this grade. What am I supposed to do with it?
Just read it and just pass it around.
What is it?
It's about the book. And Greg's giving you a deal on it if you care about reading. I'm sorry, I know you have glasses on.
Okay, I have a book, so I will pass it.
Hey, you think why Mitt Romney...
Actually, that's the first book. The real one's coming out in October.
Okay.
The real one will be about 60 pages bigger. It's got 11 more chapters. A lot of the things I think are solutions, and a lot of the stories that I went through are going to be in the new book. It's going to be bigger and better. So thank you, but there's better coming. Yeah.
With the solutions that you're offering, therefore, what can we do?
You can do nothing except to insist that those people who ask for your vote, you say, the condition of my vote is for doing these types of things. I mean, as far as a citizen, what can you do about national government? Nothing. Not really.
I don't trust the voting system, so that's a problem.
But that's the only way you can attack it, is to insist those people who are representing you agree that these are the solutions that have to go forward. And I think if enough people do that as a condition of their support, nothing will happen. Eventually, I hope things take place. I mean, things have either got to improve or the entire thing collapses. I still think they can improve, and I want them to improve. And I think these are things...
Well, the people rise up, yes, absolutely.
Do you think it's going to happen now?
Well, you have to get activism, you have to enlighten people so that, and run for delegates and, so that the word can get out.
But what's really the truth? What's really going to happen in the future?
If I did that, I'd have a different job. It's like...
He'd be governor.
Bishop is my last name. It's not a title. For obvious reasons. I don't know, but
I don't know.
And I'm scared.
Trump predicted that Mitt Romney wasn't going to run again when Trump said 4 years ago that if Mitt Romney ran today, that the people of Utah would never elect him to be the dog catcher. So he predicted Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
And I think there is a high probability that could have happened, but I can't guarantee that would have been the result. Romney had a lot of money, and there were a lot of people who aren't necessarily Republicans who would be supporting him.
Yeah.
So depending on the circumstances, it could have happened. But I also think Romney did the right thing. And he was also right in saying that if he went one more term, he'd be in his 80s when it was over. And there is a time, Biden, there is a time when it's actually too long.
Yeah.
Remember a couple of things. It's just city history. Remember how we thought everyone said Eisenhower was too old to be president? Well, he retired before he was 67. And then they said Reagan was too old to be president, and he retired when he was 77. And now we say Biden is in his 80s and should have a second term?
Yeah. It's insane.
There's something wrong. I also think the elections are... Back in 1952 when Eisenhower ran, he did not announce until March of that election year whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. And he did not start his campaign for 2 months later when he resigned as head of NATO forces and came back. That's when the election started. When Barry Goldwater ran in 1964, he announced on January 3rd, and he apologized for starting his campaign so early. If there's something else I would like to do, is make sure that no one could actually run for an election until the actual election year. To have 4-year campaigns for the presidency, there's no way I can enforce that. But it's just ridiculous.
It is.
Seeing
Money.
what we're doing. And spending, yes.
My father was in politics up in Canada. He was an alderman and being groomed for, actually towards being a premier. And once he got into the deeper politics of what was going on in Canada, he was informed about a meeting that was in Ottawa where the bankers got together and chose who was going to be put into office. Who was Trudeau, who was a card-carrying communist member and a gay man, and was 3 months before the election.
Trudeau the father or the current Trudeau?
No, the father.
Okay.
At which point he was placed into office because the media and everything else was pushing for him. And he was put into office. So we've known about this corruption for decades. And the things that are going on in government and in the banking portion of funding who is going to be put into office really doesn't let us know whether we're putting in who we want put in or not.
It's a difficult task and a difficult concept to do with it, and that's why I honestly like the convention system, because when I ran, I didn't have that many. I didn't have those kind of people, and because we had delegates that you could sit and talk to in the front room, I was able to win because there were people, common people. It can be done. The right things can happen. The wrong things can happen as well. We have to make sure that we're part of the process to make sure that the right things do happen.
Absolutely, but you're talking to the choir.
We get it.
At least I'm not singing to the choir. That's the problem. I am the choir leader in World War II. And I have been forever, for 20 years.
Do you do a podcast, or do you make what you're teaching to the university accessible first?
I have not before, but with Greg, he's going to start a website, and we may start doing that. I don't think I will ever do a podcast. That's too much work for me. There's a British comedy about a retired person that said, now that I'm retired, I do fewer things very slowly. That's me. I do fewer things very slowly. But we want to put more of that, especially as we start to publicize the book and the kinds of things that I think people should know about Congress in the book. We'll try and do more of that.
Maybe you could be a guest on like Jason Preston's podcast or something like that.
I would be honored to.
Can people take your class, like online? You know how they do it live?
No, but one of the things we did talk about is working with some of the homeschoolers about trying to put on some of these things in a curriculum that you could use as a homeschool. Right now, I teach at Utah State, just one class a fall, and basically what the book is what the class is as well. What I try and go through is how Congress actually functions, and I do spend a lot of time with them talking about the verbiage of the Declaration as well as the Constitution, so they know it as well. Because I think too often kids today, I did, just kind of split through it and don't understand it. They don't understand the significance of just what the words mean. In fact, maybe somebody here can help me. One of my favorite, this is something I've never had a student been able to handle for me. One of my favorite British comedies was Fawlty Towers. And it's where John Cleese has, you've seen it, good, it's brilliant. He has Manuel, the waiter, the servant guy from Barcelona, doesn't speak good English. And he's trying to communicate with him, and finally in disgust, he walks out and says, "Say goodnight, Gracie." Then I ask my students, what does that mean? Does anyone have an idea about "Say goodnight, Gracie"? Anyone in here got that one for me?
Great. Yeah, George and Gracie. they did stand-up comedy, and he'd say goodnight, Gracie.
And she'd say
She would
goodnight,
say
Gracie.
goodnight, Gracie.
So, yes, often.
Yeah.
But the key element, that was their tagline, the end of their monologue at the end. And that's one of the few shows that I think still holds up today. When you watch the old Burns and Allen show, I still think it's funny, because she was incredible. Well, I do that to students, and they have actually no idea.
Well, they wouldn't,
If I try and
because they're too young.
If I try and tell her that Gracie Allen's was the first dumb blonde, they'll say, oh, I know what that means. They'll get that part. One of the things I try and do is one of the things you need to do to understand the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence is to understand what the words meant at the time. For example, the word awful today is a negative word. But when they wrote about the first dedication of the Capitol building, they said the Reverend gave an awful prayer. What they meant was,
In awe.
It was in awe. That's what awful meant. What did Hillary Clinton say Republicans were? What was the word?
The basket of deplorable.
Deplorable, yes. What did deplorable mean at the time of the Declaration and the Constitution? In fact, one of the things that started the duel between Hamilton and Burr was Hamilton wrote that Burr was deplorable. Deplorable back then had a connotation of sexual deviance. That's a word that was there. I'll give you an easy one, the word upset. If today somebody upsets it, that means the underdog finally won.
Yeah.
Man of War was probably the greatest racehorse ever. He ran 21 races. He won 20 of his 21 races. The one race he lost to was a horse called Upset. Before that, upset meant your stomach was giving you problems or you were mad. The idea of an underdog winning didn't happen until 1921 after Upset finally beat Man of War, and that's where the word developed. So when I go through, another one is when
A stitch in time saved 9. All these, yeah.
In the Constitution, it talks about a more perfect union. That's one of the things I have to talk about. What is a more perfect union? Because I'm sorry, that's horrible grammar. And these guys, I mean, you can either be perfect or you're not perfect. You can't be more perfect or less perfect. Now, were they dumb people that didn't understand grammar? No, when they wrote more perfect union, that was a historical phrase, which meant the unification of Scotland and England. They called their perfect unification. Because what it meant is that all of a sudden you didn't need to have troops stationed within your country to worry about Scotland or England, which if you weren't attacking either Scotland or England, the king could use it to attack the people. Now all of a sudden you can minimize the amount of internal troops you needed and only worry about things work. So having a more perfect union was a political term.
Well, it's like a cultural slang, you know? Yeah. And that's the things about in the scriptures too. So as you read the scriptures, that doesn't make sense. It's the way they talked at the time.
And you get them down, and the more you understand history, the more we understand what those things mean and the concepts. So that's another lesson I go over an entire. In fact, there's about 3 pages on words meant
Get the 1828 dictionary. That will help. Webster.
Even today, it would like. I was walking to the Capitol one day, and I always wore 3-piece suits because at my size I needed more fabric to cover me. So I was walking in a tan 3-piece suit, and this kid came out of one of the apartments, and I knew it was a teenager because he was texting, and he didn't have shoes. And he came walking by me, and he looked at my suit, and he said, "That is so fly," and walked away.
So fly.
And I had no idea. So I checked my zipper first, and had no idea whether I had just been complimented or insulted until I got back to the office and we looked up an Urban Dictionary and found out that fly was actually a compliment in the Urban Dictionary. We have the same issues today. We got to know what the words mean.
Yeah.
Yesterday my daughter says, Mom, I don't like that girl because she always spills the tea. And I'm like, so what? You don't have to clean it up.
Spills the tea.
Yes, spills the tea.
What is that supposed to mean?
Oh, gossip?
Yeah, that's a new one for me.
think everyone needs to read the Federalist Papers as well, too, to really get an understanding
Yeah.
of the dynamics of the Constitutional Convention as well, too, to understand. If you want to know what the framers were thinking, that's a really good starting point.
It's an excellent one, and I also recommend taking letters from a Virginia farmer, who are, the leads were anti-federalists, and they were arguing against it, but some of the things they argued against it were phenomenally insightful, and some of the problems that we have. Like, they're the ones that are arguing about that auxiliary precautions. The states really don't have authority to stand up to the national government. They were arguing that at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. Those are some concerns we should look at, because a lot of those are spot on.
Well, Glenn Beck's book, The Original Intent, helps define what the Federalist Papers are to simplify it too, so.
And Glenn Beck I think has the right image of all of these issues that are going forward.
Yeah.
Especially his view of Woodrow Wilson.
And he's coming
Oh,
on the
yeah.
19th. He's coming on the 19th.
Here's it, yeah.
It's $10 at Mountain America, and he's advertising it on the radio this morning. I've had these for a few days, and
That's cool.
it's filling fast. So what was it that you said to read?
They're called Letters from a Virginia Farmer. There's actually a book out called The Anti-Federalist Papers, which tries to collect much of the arguments that the anti-federalists had, which I think sometimes you need to look at them to see maybe there is some element to it.
Okay, so that's a book, and what was the other thing? Sorry,
Federalist Papers.
Well,
I've got that, but
Anti-Federalist Letters from a Virginia Farmer.
letters, okay.
From a Virginia farmer.
Yeah, and we don't really know which Lee actually wrote those, but several of the Lees from Virginia were the ones that inspired it. Yeah.
So we know that our nanny government, or whatever you want to call it, it's a Ponzi scheme, and that there's no real money, and I mean, it's amazing that we've gone as far as we are and have, but what happened? I mean, what do you foresee happening in the future if nothing does change?
Second coming.
Bring it on.
Sooner than later. Now, and this is one of the things that I have trouble with. I talk to kids at Utah State. Utah State is probably one of the more conservative places that we have of all the colleges in Utah. It's one of the most conservative. And these are really good kids, but talking about the difference between civil rights and individual rights, and then talking about how we have come to this idea that security, fairness, and risk aversion are the important qualities, as opposed to allowing people to have choices in their life. That's a concept that's new to those kids. They really have not thought of that before. And trying, at least as best I can, to try and talk about how risk aversion is not a noble goal, and fairness is the way of how you define it. I mean, let's face it, if I took all the money in the world and gave everybody an equal share of it, that's fair. But if I allowed you to keep the efforts, the gains of your own efforts, that's fair. They're entirely different, but we have this idea of fairness. One of my heroes is John Stark, who was the hero of the Battle of Bennington in 1777. And he made the statement, "Live free or die," which is the motto of New Hampshire, and it's also on their license plates, which means if actually prisoners in penitentiaries make license plates, that would make New Hampshire the most barbaric state in the nation. But anyway, he made that statement, "Live free or die," not in the Battle of Bennington, in the heat of the moment. He made it 20 years later when he was invited to a banquet commemorating that battle, and because of his age and health he couldn't go, and he wrote back to them, "Live free or die." He still had that spirit within him that you don't waste a good revolution on changing what our priorities are to making life easier for us. That's the kind of person I want to have. That's the kind of attitude that we desperately need. And there are some good people that have that attitude, and we need to build upon it. Sir?
Quick question. Thinking about Joseph Smith's prophecy about the Constitution in the latter days here, do you think we're in that right now, or is that still an upcoming event?
I think you're in it right now, but look, I used to use that as the punchline, because I knew a whole bunch of people from Utah that were back there in Washington think that they were the ones that were going to save the Constitution. I always said somebody had to make it hang in the balance in the first place, and that was my job. Somebody else can, no, but it is, we are in the middle of that. And I think one of the things, this is a line that Ezra Taft Benson used in his book, then I can't remember the title of it now. But he said, if you were in a hijacked airplane and you get control of it again and you want to bring it back into safety, you don't do it by cutting off the motor. You have to do it by gradually getting control, turning it around, lowering the altitude, slowing the speed, and eventually coming down to a safe landing. That's what we're involved in. So the effort to actually save the Constitution is something that's not going to happen quickly, won't happen by turning off the motor. It's going to have to be by concentrated efforts to slowly turn things around and bring it to a safe landing. I think the people that have caused the problems we have did it very slowly and meticulously, bit by bit, without trying to overstep their authority. They just did it casually and quickly, and they kept going at it and going at it. And I think to return the process back to where we ought to be, we have to do it the same way. And which is what you guys are trying to do, slowly and surely, bit by bit. You keep the pressure on to try and move it in the proper direction.
And they've been doing it for 100 years.
if not more.
Yeah, 110 years, so it's not an overnight fix.
Some of the same people too.
Yeah.
I'd like to recommend my nephew to take your class. So what's the name of your class? Because
it's what do we call it? Political organizations. Because no one can define what that means.
Is it mostly political science?
Yeah, it's a political science course. It's a 400 level. It's a senior level. But and we picked that one because they wanted me to come up and teach as a congressman. In fact, I did a couple of classes while I was still in Congress. And there was a class called Political Organizations, which had been taught in a decade, but it had been approved. So if they just call mine political organizations, they didn't have to go about their approval process again. And I could basically do whatever I wanted to with it. But it's an effort. I actually do run through the book with the kids, talking about how actually running in Congress and what the philosophy of government is and how the elections actually take place. So it's political organizations. I think it's 440, something like that.
What school?
Utah State.
Okay.
You only do it in fall.
Every week, twice a week?
It's actually
Every day?
2 days a week.
Okay.
Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Is it a required class if
No.
you're in the major?
No. But it fills the major.
How many students are in your class?
This term there's only 17. There's usually about 20 to 25. But they found out what I'm actually like, so it's down to 17.
Sure.
My father has a great number of...
By what province was he in?
Alberta.
Okay. Oh, well, you're one of us.
Yeah. Well, that's all my kith and kin out there, so. He went on his mission back in the 40s, and he went down to Australia. And while he was tracking, he and his companion got into an area of the city where and this was back in Melbourne, where the...
Melbourne is how you say it, Melbourne. I'm sorry.
However, they were tracking, and the local clergy said, if you listen to the missionaries open their doors, then you're not welcome in our parish, or whatever it was. And so they were just getting doors slammed. And so they decided to go on both sides of the street, and just if somebody opened the door, then they'd call him across. Well, his companion was around the corner when a door was opened, and this man said, tell me about your religion. And so he began to tell him, and said, come on in, I want to hear it. Well, I can't find my companion. Well, then don't worry. No. So he went in, sat down with him, and started to give the first discussion, which is the plan of salvation. And the guy stopped him and said, wait a minute. You mean to say that if your mother made one mistake and she didn't repent of it, then she couldn't make it into your highest degree? Yes, that's correct. And he said then, well, Mr. Law, we have a better plan. and for the next 2.5 hours detailed how they were going to take over America in detail, with water and sex and music and drugs and all these things that we are seeing now today. And by the end, my father, being overwhelmed, finally said, "Who are you? Why did you tell me this?" The guy said, "I don't know." "Well, who are you?" "I'm the Australian chapter president of the Communistic Party. We don't care how long it takes.
Yep.
We're going to take over."
How to cook frost.
I've seen that write-up.
So,
The Melbourne man, I didn't know it was your dad.
yes, and it's on the internet. He wrote it out, and it's called The Melbourne Man, and all the details of that. But he's been with Elder Benson and had many great discussions with him, and we've got lots of stories. So.
Okay, you're gonna be a speaker. If you want.
I was in a class once quite some time ago on kinesiology, and there was this lady sitting next to me, and she started talking about a conversation that she had overheard about similar things, and I said, "What have you done about it?" And she said, "Nothing." And so I started calling around to spread the word, and I got to church office, and they said, "Hang on a minute, we need you to repeat all of this to this person." And the gist of the conversation was that there was a group of people from, I don't know, Afghanistan somewhere, and they came here as students to live and to go to school and learn our ways. And anyway, this one, and then all of a sudden they just all disappeared from right here in Utah, Salt Lake. And they went to Canada, and this one guy called this lady that he had been living with her and her family, and he was a University of Utah student, and he said, "There is crack coming down, and I've grown to love you and the kindness of your heart and your generosity, but you need to get up and move, get out of the United States of America, because we're going to start doing all of these things." And I'm like, whoa. And so I told that to somebody at church office, and they said, "You're not the only one." I'm like,
Oh, it's all Satan's plan, and the cabal, and the Gadiantons, and all of that.
no kidding.
It's been a long process. They're slow and steady.
That's the whole thing, slow and steady.
And we need to fight back on that.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the purpose of the Constitution, is to make sure that not one person or one cabal is too powerful.
Yep.
Which is where federalism comes back in, which is the other thing we've got to do. More federalism, more checks and balances.
And more curbing of special interests like George Soros and others who are doing exactly using money to buy freedom and take away.
Well, and now they've come down into the cities of the state. They're not working on federal government. They're at the local level. And we have to be proactive at the local level.
But I obviously don't have money. I think there's still some things that we can do.
Oh, I
More
agree.
people like me can actually do.
Yeah.
Push back. We've got to. And that's actually what your group is doing.
Yeah.
I'm going to say, it's people coming together with like minds. That's what holds the Constitution together.
Yeah.
More than anything else.
And that's why we're teaching here. Yep. So the people's eyes are opened.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel like I'm sorry. There's my favorite story. This is the conclusion story, I hope. Was about when Huey Long was elected senator from Louisiana, and he went back to Washington the first time. And the first trip back to Louisiana, at the end of that first session of Congress, they asked him if all the talking in Washington bothered him. And he said, "No, the talking doesn't bother me. It's the listening that bores the hell out of me." And I feel I have put you in that position of having to listen.
No!
So I apologize for that.
So well said.
Thank you.
Well, I would just say
Appreciate
that
it.
every civilization that has gone down this path has tanked and been destroyed, and so God is greater.
Yes.
So thank you for being a part of that.
Thank you,
No,
appreciate it.
Thank you for allowing me to come here and talk about it and at least explain that I learned a whole lot when I was back there, and I tried to write it down into a book form, and someday we'll see if we can expand it beyond just the book into other areas.
Can I ask something, Colette, off subject here? How many of you guys have kids or grandkids in Alpine School District?
Oh,
I do. Quite a few, okay. I'm gonna bring a flyer, I'll print it for you first, Colette.
Okay.
But we're actually having a meeting on how to handle Title IX. You guys seen the Fox Hollow, how they're letting little boys go into the girls' bathrooms and vice versa? They're actually implementing that now, in Fox Hollow. So we're gonna do a meeting on how to declare our rights. I'd be interested to hear what you'd have to say about that, but we've actually done it and it's working in some areas. So, I'll bring a flyer.
Okay.
I thought we already took care of that with just one neutral bathroom in most places.
Well, apparently, I mean, go look on Fox Hollow, they're actually making a big deal about it. And people are upset about it. But it's not gonna stop. It's still the Title IX, and you maybe can tell me, the Title IX, when they're taking money from the government, just like you said, they're under their reign.
Yeah.
It's really up to our governor to decide, our legislation to decide that. So they don't have to. Constitutionally, we have the right to handle our own spending and our own education. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a legislator decision. It's not the governor's. It's actually not the Board of Education, even though they think it is.
Okay,
The
so
legislature.
legislation, yeah. And see, that's really what we're doing, is we're trying to figure out where to send the declarations to. We're sending them to the Alpine School District and any other school district, declaring our First Amendment rights. So my little boy, as a Christian, should not have to be told he has to call a little boy a girl or a little girl a boy, because that's
Or pronouns.
it's not scientific. So we're requiring that, but it's the legislators that we have to send it to.
So in these bathroom things, I'm a daughter of the American Revolution, and I was at a naturalization ceremony earlier this year, and I went into the ladies' restroom, sat down, and was doing my business, and I looked there, and there's men's feet underneath the stall. I came unglued. It was horrific. And I said, there are men's bathrooms, and this one lady, his wife, said, well, I invited him in so that he could help me in here with the baby. And I said, you know what, there are family restrooms. Oh my gosh, I can't tell you, it felt like I had been electrocuted and fried beyond. And these people were sweet and accommodating, and they thought that they weren't going to get their naturalization done. And I said, no, you will. I'll make sure of it. But here you don't do that, you know. And I went and told some of the head ladies, and then I spoke to the judge later about it, and I'm like, I can't tell you, it boils my blood. You know, to
You have a
sit
right
down.
of privacy, so it is a hard.
When you talk to your legislators, though, about this or any other issue, because I was there, I realized it is very easy, especially in social services, to round out our budgets by accepting a program that has a 3 or 4 to 1 match. So $1 of state money you put in, you can get $4 of federal money coming in. It helps out because that way you don't raise the taxes on people, which makes it good, but you give them programs. But that's why they will always push back, whether they like it or not, because that's how we round out the budgets in the state of
But if
Utah.
it's breaking our constitutional rights, it's their job to fix it. So they can demand not to pay so much. Correct me, I work for a constitutional attorney, and they're saying that the way that it was set up, we don't have to give the government that much money. We can say we're controlling our education, and they're going to have to pass a law and fight with the Congress federally and say, no, we're going to maintain this much. They don't have to give that to them. For them to have to beg for it is unconstitutional. It's not the way it's set up. And it's a problem, but it's their problem. It's not our problem.
That's the mindset you have to comprehend with them. So it can't be really confrontational, you have to work around that in
Yeah,
some way.
well-
So they have to realize that
When
they are
we go in-
losing control by taking the money in the first place.
Yeah, when we go in, we've gone into sheriff's office, we've gone into city councils, we go in as allies. We say, look, you lose your voice, you lose your power, we lose our voice, so what can we do to help you? So we've had actually we just had a meeting with Orem City Council and Vineyard last week, and it went really well. We were actually, defending Utah happens to be, like, he thinks that all congressmen, all people are just on the same page. And so it was good for him to listen to, hey, these guys don't know any different, they're doing what they think they can. We're declaring our rights and telling them what the Constitution says. It kind of puts them in check on what they can and can't do. We're not asking for permission, but we're not being aggressive about it either. We're saying, this is our constitutional right, you go fix it. So, anyway, I'll bring the flyers.
All right, Dina, great.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me take that.
Thank you again, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Go ahead and pull that off.